episode of Our Interesting Times. It's my pleasure to have William Engdahl back on the show. Mr. Engdahl is an award-winning geopolitical analyst, strategic risk consultant, author, and lecturer. He's authored many books, including international best-selling A Century of War, Anglo-American Oil Politics, Seeds of Destruction, The Hidden Agenda of Genetic Manipulation, Full-Spectrum Dominance, Totalitarian Democracy and the New World Order, Myth, Lies, and Oil Wars, and The Gods of Money, Wall Street and the Death of the American Century. All those books I can personally endorse because I've read them all, and they're excellent works. Mr. Engdahl, thanks for coming back on the show.
Thank you for having me, Tim.
Well, listen, recently you released this unpublished chapter regarding the Round Table and its intrigues in the interwar period and their and the role they played in the fomenting of the Second World War, and
yes,
probably the broader geopolitical strategy of the 20th century regarding first the British Empire, then the American Empire, the Anglo-American Atlanticist powers. And you've, of course, as I mentioned, you've written the book Gods of Money, which is very relevant considering today's events, geopolitical events, and also domestic politics, both here in the United States and also what's going on in Europe. So what motivated you to release this heretofore unpublished article about the coming of the Second World War?
I reflected on this whole Brexit process some months ago, and what became more and more clear to me is that this wasn't simply a vote of democracy of 51 or 53% of the voters who bothered to vote wanting to out from the European Union. The sentiment is quite strong in Britain. I know that personally. It was more the financial oligarchs of the City of London, a very, very powerful factor in the British political calculus, and the monarchy. They had concluded that the European Union was increasingly becoming a German-dominated entity of, 28 nations now, where the once great British Empire was a kind of a pimple on the elbow of the EU, if you want to put it bluntly, and that they had no influence in the decisions. They are outside the euro. That was ensured by Washington in 1992 when they nudged George Soros into making this hedge fund attack on the British pound before they could join the European rate mechanism. And so they opted to leave the European Union, and they will leave the European Union, the so-called Brexit. But more and more, I began to see signs that the British strategy was to create and is to create an English-speaking union. And that brought to mind something that I had researched, about 10, 12 years ago as part of a book that one day I will complete, but the research is invaluable despite, and that's why I decided to publish it. By the way, for listeners who are interested, if you go onto my website as a first viewer, williamengdahl.com, you'll get a question if you want to subscribe to my free newsletter. And this is what you're referring to, Tim. This was one of the twice monthly samples of my work that I put out on this free newsletter. So the idea was to go back to the original architects of the so-called English-speaking union who shaped the policies of Winston Churchill around World War II. And that was an organization that Carroll Quigley, if you know the famous Georgetown professor who wrote this book, Tragedy and Hope, he also wrote a much smaller book called The Anglo-American Establishment. And it's basically a book about this secret society back then, which was called the Round Table. It was founded by the South African British mining magnate Cecil Rhodes through his will. And it was no doubt the most powerful, influential group of perhaps 24 individuals inside Britain that shaped not only the First World War, but the Second World War. And that's the background to why I published that.
Yeah, in the article, you begin with H.G. Wells. And H.G. Wells talking how, well, the curse of the world is nationalism. And you had to destroy the idea of the nation state, of national identity, in order to bring about world peace under Anglo auspices, of course, control. And, and this was,
of course,
what he referred to as the open conspiracy. Of course, this would bring this type of, you could say, dialectic, this type of synthesis, I guess, would come about through fomented conflict, kind of a pretext, because they had to create this conflict, a war so disastrous, to convince the people that the bane of humanity is nationalism.
Yeah. Well, they indeed did a pretty good job of that, in certainly in Germany, and not in Japan. I don't think that it stuck in Japan, but H.G. Wells, he's very famous for all his novels and so forth, but he was an insider in the circles of not only the Round Table, but the British establishment back then. And he wrote a book called The Open Conspiracy. And he said the world state has to be built on the ashes of war. And this is what he called the open conspiracy. And he said we have to create a new world order where yapping about nationality, like dogs, as he termed it, would be eliminated in favor of the world state. Well, if you read the memoirs of people like David Rockefeller, it's precisely this that he talks about. If I'm accused of being in favor of a world state, I proudly accept that attack, or that accusation rather. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, in all his writings, is completely against the idea of nation state. And this is what is going on today in the European Union. The nation state, national identity, is being eroded, destroyed, whatever, from every single angle through something that's supranational, unelected, called the European Union Commission. And it's also happening in the United States. It's happening well around the world, so that the few nation states who defend national sovereignty are attacked as though they were the reincarnation of Adolf Hitler. I'm referring to Vladimir Putin and Russia. I'm referring to China under Xi Jinping, but not only previous leaders of China. I'm referring to Iran and other nations that say, well, for example, Hungary in the European Union. The Prime Minister of Hungary, Viktor Orban, is demonized within the European Union for wanting to defend the national culture, the history of the Hungarian people, the economy of Hungary, and so forth, against a Brussels-dictated influx of tens or hundreds of thousands of war refugees from Syria, from North Africa, Libya, and so forth, that the Brussels unelected bureaucrats demand that Hungary take and pay for. And Viktor Orban says we have to defend a very proud culture here, and we don't need war refugees for our economy. We have unemployment. We need to employ and train Hungarian people who have share the same cultural values. So this idea of the dissolution of the nation state was fundamental to the view of the world empire of the British Round Table.
And there are two key important points to this plan. One is of course, Halford Mackinder and the idea of, geostrategy or geopolitics is kind of his. I think he coined the term, didn't he? And there's also this.
Yes, because he was a geographer. He was a member of the Royal Geographical Society of Great Britain. And his first seminal essay, was delivered in 1904 in a speech to the Royal Geographical Society. It was titled The geographical pivot of history. And I must give him credit. Mackinder was a genius of a very special kind, brilliant, and he looked throughout history at the relation of geography. For example, Russia historically is this vast landmass crossing Eurasia from Vladivostok on the Pacific to Northern Europe. And Russia has never successfully been invaded by land, not by Napoleon, not by Hitler, and so forth. And Mackinder talks about Russia as the heartland. And he said, British policy as an island power is to control the seas, control the oceans of the world, and prevent a combination of what he calls Central Europe, by which he meant Germany, France, Poland, and the countries around Central Europe, continental Europe, an alliance with the heartland, Russia. Later he called the heartland possibly China. But the point is the same. And he said, if Central Europe and the heartland come together, they have the potential to control the world island. And for Mackinder, the world island was all of Eurasia down to the Middle East and North Africa. And of course, all the oil wealth of that, which was beginning to become known to the British in as early as 1904. But this was written in 1919 after Versailles and the First World War. And who controls the world island controls the world. So if you look at American foreign policy from the standpoint of Mackinder, they absorbed the lessons of Mackinder. Brzezinski is a student of Mackinder's geopolitics. He mentions it in his book, The Grand Chessboard. Henry Kissinger is another student of Mackinder and British geopolitics. And that became American foreign policy as a successor power or a successor empire, although Americans, we don't like this word empire, but that's exactly what it was designed to be, successor to the British Empire.
Now, in order to achieve this objective, there are two things that the British Empire had to do, because I think you've mentioned in your writings and your many interviews that by the coming of the second decade of the 20th century, the British Empire was in a crisis and relative decline compared to Germany, even to Russia, which is coming on like gangbusters. So they realized that they'd have to forge a reunion with the United States, that it did just do all sorts of diplomatic, intelligence, and also cultural programs. This is all part of the Rhodes Trust. And also a second part of that, in order to take on the continental powers, they had to somehow foment a situation where both Germany and Russia, who you would think would have all the interest in uniting, to divide them. And also to, of course, this Entente Cordial Entente, or Entente Cordial with France. And this was a change from Britain's splendid isolation policy of the 19th century to manipulate things on the continent more directly, I guess, because you're sending in the expeditionary force in World War I, and these things were a change of policy for the British Empire, because they recognized that because of what Germany had achieved in the late 19th century with its industrialization. And I think you mentioned about this spectacular railroad network that had been built, and also Germany's plans to sort of break out. And you also mentioned how Hitler and his gang were unwitting agents of British foreign policy. So that's a lot there to discuss. Do you want to take all that on there? But it explains much about what happened in the 20th century.
The British policy, if we talk about the period of World War I, Germany had emerged. There were two nations that emerged as a contender for the then economically bankrupt British Empire. In 1873, this is almost ignored in the economic history books, but in 1873, Great Britain underwent what is called in British economic history the Great Depression. They underwent their Great Depression. It lasted 25 years until almost the end of the 19th century. And as a result of that Great Depression, they came into the 20th century a greatly weakened world empire. Now, world empires require money to maintain troops of occupation in places like Egypt or throughout Africa, South Africa, in the Middle East, in India, and so forth. And suddenly there emerged two contenders on the map, and that was Germany, which underwent after 1871 the most dramatic economic expansion or growth of any power on earth in previous history, and then the United States of America after the Civil War, which emerged with a comparable economic growth, perhaps not as coherently and tightly planned as the German growth, but every bit as impressive. And the question at that point in 1914 is, who will succeed the bankrupt British Empire? Because they were bankrupt. And Germany had one idea who that should be, and the United States, under the House of J.P. Morgan, another idea. And Britain decided to take on the German rival, and Germany had created, Deutsche Bank had created an infrastructure project going from Berlin to Baghdad, which then was part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, today's part of Iraq. And the Baghdad-Berlin Railway was a land bridge avoiding Britain's control of the seas. Britain controlled Gibraltar, Britain controlled Malta, Britain controlled Cyprus, and so forth, in order to make sure that no continental power could challenge them. Well, the Baghdad Overland Railway line outflanked the British. So that became one of two casus belli, causes of the war. The second was the decision by the Kaiser and the German parliament to create a German deep-water navy with a fleet of ships comparable to the British dreadnought to defend Germany's expansion in Turkey and throughout the Middle East and elsewhere. Well, at that time, Britain had decided to transform the British Royal Navy from coal-powered to oil-powered ships. They didn't know that Britain had North Sea oil. They weren't technically equipped to develop it, even if they did. But they knew that Iran, or Persia then, had this vast reserve of petroleum that could be tapped with minimal expense and so forth to provide fuel for the transformation. But if Germany built a land rail link to Baghdad, they could extend that to the waters of the Persian Gulf and challenge the British oil supplies for the Royal Navy. So this was considered in London by the Round Table and others as a cause to go to war, to destroy Germany's growing ambitions. So that was the background to the alliance of Britain with France, the Entente Cordiale that you mentioned after the 1880s, and with Russia. This was one of the huge mistakes that the Russian Tsar Nicholas made, is allowing Russia to be entrapped in the snare of this British Triple Entente that surrounded the Germans. Long and short, Britain was bankrupt at the outbreak of World War I. They figured it would be a 6-month war. They would topple Germany, and it would be like Bush in Iraq in 2003, and it wasn't. So they needed to borrow money. They needed to go begging for money to finance the British war effort as it went on from year to year to year. And the House of Morgan became the banker for the British government. they purchased through war loans, they purchased the munitions from Remington Arms and other companies that were part of the J.P. Morgan group of corporations. And through that, the British and the French and the Italians were able to fight this insane war called World War I in the trenches of France and across Europe.
There was wasn't Remington Small Arms, was that Samuel Bush family? And how they got involved in the, some of the war profiting that occurred. And
also a chemical company was involved in the war in World War I by the name of Monsanto, and that was part of the Rockefeller group of companies that were emerging back then.
Yes, the Powder Trust that got so much money from Bernard Baruch and those guys. Billions of dollars went missing and all that during the war. So there's a lot of, and this led to a lot of disillusionment in the 1920s here in the United States regarding these things, and why you had the policy of so-called isolation or normalcy in the 1920s. But into the 1930s, of course, the war drags on a lot longer than it should have had. Of course, the British sent close to 1 million troops into the Middle East, right, in the middle of this, out of Europe into the Middle East to secure the oil fields during that conflict. Yeah. It was most people know that through the Peter O'Toole's portrayal of Lawrence of Arabia. Of course, that set up all the intrigues in the Middle East today. All the borders that were drawn out, Sykes-Picot and that agreement. And today's conflicts. And also you had the Balfour Declaration, which was motivated largely by British, the financial needs, and also the fact that the Balfour Declaration carried with a guarantee by here in the States, by Jewish influence in the United States, to get the country into the war. United States into the First World War, which proved to be, at the key moment, the Doughboys showed up and they were able to stop the German offensive in 1918. The Germans, were exhausted, and then you had, the German army melted away. Then you had Versailles. The Germans surrender, or at least they sued for peace. They didn't really surrender; they sued for peace under the terms of the 14 points, which the Allies quickly forgot, and that set the stage for the Second World War. And in this article, you cover the 1930s, how Germany was sort of maneuvered into this by the British, by the Cliveden set, sort of this dual policy. I did a series of interviews. I think he interviewed you too. Jay Dyer did a long series of Tragedy Hope, and he keyed on this one chapter that Quigley focuses on some of the intrigues of the Cliveden set in the late 1930s period, how they followed this dual policy of appeasement and also confronting Germany. And that's been way it was taught to most people was this were like pro-Nazi factions within the British government confronting those that had a more realistic view of Hitler. But it turns out this was just all part of a dialectic or game that was being played by Britain to, embolden Germany or antagonize Germany into starting a shooting war for this long-term plan. Because you mentioned as before even the first guns were fired in 1939. You had this the War and Peace Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations, which spelled out the whole post-war program. Do you want to get into that? I mean, that's pretty interesting, how they had it all planned out.
Yeah, this I talk about in great length in my book, Gods of Money, which is a history of Wall Street systematically over a period of a century or more after the turn of the century, around the time of World War I, taking over all crucial institutions of the United States of America, Washington, the presidency, and so forth, and right up to the present. And where shall I start on this?
I know.
New York Council on Foreign Relations in the 1930s, there's one interesting thing you may not know about Carroll Quigley and the Tragedy and Hope book, and I have this on very good authority. Quigley was given access to all of the archives of the New York Council on Foreign Relations, which, by the way, was established at Versailles in 1919 in private meetings between J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, parties on the U.S. side and the Round Table on the side of the British. What later became Chatham House, the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and the Council on Foreign Relations on the U.S. side. And in 1939, the Council on Foreign Relations, the point about Carroll Quigley is that he was given access to all of the archives of the CFR on one condition, that he not in his book mention the role of the Rockefeller faction in U.S. history. Now, you go into the index of Quigley's, I think it's 1,100-page volume of the Tragedy and Hope, and you find one reference to Nelson Rockefeller, and it's a completely trivial reference, and you would think the Rockefellers didn't exist in the history of the 20th century. So the book is fascinating on one level, and it's fundamentally flawed on that level. So in 1931, the House of Morgan essentially lost. The British abandoned the gold standard, the U.S. gold standard. That was the great J.P. Morgan stratagem after Versailles, is to create a U.S. dollar gold standard. And they intervened in South Africa to bring that about. They put the British in the jaws of a vice in the 1920s because Britain couldn't afford to go back on gold. And when they did, they went in on a vastly overvalued level of the British pound sterling. So when the Great Depression broke in the United States, Britain in 1931 went off the gold standard, and with that, they ended their special relationship with the House of J.P. Morgan as financial agent for the British Crown or the British government. And after that point, J.P. Morgan was the loser in the financial crises that swept across Germany, France, Austria, Kreditanstalt, and so forth. And who emerged out of the rubble of that faction fight was the Rockefeller faction. Under Roosevelt, if you look very closely, very quietly, the Rockefellers began to emerge as key advisors. Icky, a number of them, I documented in the Gods of Money book. And in 1939, the Rockefeller Foundation financed a top-secret study to be carried out by the Council on Foreign Relations, which they, at that point, had the money to dominate. And the study was called the War and Peace Studies. Isaiah Bowman, who called himself at one point America's Haushofer, America's geopolitical strategist, he was a key member of that. He was a geographer. And key people, area specialists from every corner of the world. And they said in 1939, before the Nazis had invaded Poland, they said there will be a world war and America will emerge from the ashes of that world war as the dominant power replacing the British Empire. It took 2 world wars for them to reach this. And they said, we began planning now how we run that post-war world. And that's War and Peace Studies of the Council on Foreign Relations. And they did something rather clever in terms of propaganda. They said, we will not make the mistake that the British made. We won't call ours an American empire. We'll call it the export of democracy, of the American free enterprise system, freedom in the American way of life, and so forth. And I have to give them credit on that. It was brilliant because much of the world that wanted to liberate themselves from British colonial oppression or French or Portuguese or whatever in Africa and India and whatnot, they said, oh, America is the great defender of democracy. Let's rally to them. So it was a brilliant exercise, if you will, of soft power, but it was very calculated. And that group later was sent down, the professors and so forth, were sent down to Washington with an agreement with Roosevelt to literally dominate the key positions in the State Department, the Asian and Middle East and all the other key positions. And the creation of the United Nations was their project. They said, we will replace the British-dominated League of Nations with an American-dominated United Nations. The Rockefeller brothers donated the land in the east side of New York that they owned to become the world headquarters of this new United Nations. In the process, as Rockefellers usually try to do, they made billions of dollars on the real estate that they owned adjacent to the United Nations, because all of the UN ambassadors from every nation in the world had to have very, very well-equipped, beautiful apartments in the area of the East Side. So it created an economic boom on the East Side real estate market that was largely owned by the Rockefellers. In any case, so the United Nations was one of their projects. It didn't work out quite as they had planned, but that's another question. So the post-1945 period was shaped and dominated by Wall Street, the Bretton Woods Agreement. You had Harry Dexter White, the Deputy Treasury Secretary, negotiating at Bretton Woods in 1944, and you had John Maynard Keynes on behalf of the British Treasury negotiating. But behind Dexter White were Chase Bank of the Rockefeller family, Citigroup of the Rockefeller family, and the banks of Wall Street. And they literally dictated what the post-war monetary order would be. It would be a dollar-based monetary system. They would call it the gold exchange standard, but under the gold exchange standard, all of the currencies of the members of the International Monetary Fund countries, Europe and so forth, all their currencies would be convertible into the US dollar, and only the US dollar would be convertible to gold. So that was the basis of the American century, as Henry Luce called it in 1941. And at that time, through hook and crook, both, the Federal Reserve held 70%, an estimated 70% of all the world's monetary gold. So the dollar literally was as good as gold back then. That eroded dramatically up until 1973, when Nixon, on the advice of David Rockefeller's favorite Chase Manhattan banker, Paul Volcker, took the U.S. out of the Bretton Woods Agreement and off the gold exchange.
And that was facilitated because during the war, I guess America had accumulated close to 70% of all the world's known gold supply.
Yes.
Yeah. And there's also the issue of of course, the post-war stolen gold, both in Asia and in Europe.
That's a
whole other can of worms. But
it's another can of worms, and
yes.
It's a complex subject because a lot of that was kept by what became the CIA and kept off the books. So it's really a topic for another discussion entirely, yes. I would say.
Now, in order to getting back to America, the American century, and of course getting the American public to support this program, a lot of propaganda, a lot of psychological warfare had to be carried out, and this was done. You mentioned in the article how the wartime and also you could argue the post-war formation of the intelligence community, the OSS, and the CIA, was done largely under British instruction. William Stevenson and also Roald Dahl and these guys, Ian Fleming, they recruited William Donovan, and of course you had the operation out of Rockefeller Center, where they were set up rent-free, courtesy of the Roosevelt administration, to carry out also dirty tricks programs here in the United States to undermine opposition to America's entry into the war. America First Committee, a lot of slander, some say even murder was carried out, blackmail, sexual espionage, that sort of thing. Usual. Also a media campaign. You talk about Walter Lippmann and people like Edward Murrow, who was a stage actor, which you mentioned, which is very important because we have today's issue of so-called fake news, and what is fake news, and who's carrying out the fake news, and how a lot of the media types that we rely on for our information are actors in a sense, and much of what we come to see as the mainstream media, legacy media, the network news, grew out of Office of War Information, OSS, psychological warfare. Do you want to maybe address those? How that factored into this program? Intelligence and also propaganda, news, fake news, and that's what was pandered, what was peddled that day as news.
I think if you go back to a figure who comes out of World War I and the secret group around Woodrow Wilson to shape war propaganda for Washington toward the American public to galvanize them for a war that Wilson was elected in 1916, reelected, to keep America out of war. And 1 year later, America was fully in that war. How did that happen? Well, they had a propaganda group, and a key member of that was the nephew of a Viennese psychoanalyst by the name of Sigmund Freud. He was unknown at that point in America, but his nephew, a man named Edward Bernays, had digested the psychological works, how to manipulate the unconscious or how the unconscious works and so forth, of Freud, his uncle, and began creating propaganda that would bring American people into the war. And the propaganda has not changed in one single feature right up until the present with these false flag sarin gas attacks where the daughter of President Trump is so horrified and disgusted at pictures of little children being killed by sarin gas in Syria. And Bernays said, you have to manipulate the emotions of the American people to hate the enemy. And so they would make cartoons, and the cartoons would have this big gorilla who would obviously have the name Germany written across his bear-like chest and a pointed helmet like the Prussian military war in those days. And he would have a bayonet, and there would be a little cartoon of a baby on the ground, and the baby would have the word Belgium written on its belly, and the bayonet would be spurting blood out of the belly of this baby called Belgium. And these images this is very primitive in the time, but it worked very, very well. And to counter that, the German government had a rational propaganda effort to convince logically the American people it's against their interest to go to war. And afterwards, people did studies of the comparison of U.S. propaganda and German propaganda, and they said the Germans lost out because they appealed to reason, not emotions. People act on emotions.
Yes, yes.
Every war America has been into has been manipulated by emotions. Look at the invasion of Iraq in 1999 by Bush Sr. There was a testimony by a woman in front of the U.S. Congress who supposedly was a nurse in a Kuwaiti hospital that had been occupied by Iraq, by Saddam Hussein on encouragement of April Glaspie, the U.S. ambassador. And this nurse, quote unquote, testified to the U.S. Congress, and all the cameras were rolling, that she witnessed Iraqi soldiers come in to the room with the newborn in the incubators, threw them out of the incubators on the floor, and stabbed them with their bayonets. Doesn't this sound familiar? Well, later it turned out that an American CIA-connected PR company hired the daughter of the Kuwaiti ambassador to the U.S. to pose as a nurse. She was no nurse. She witnessed nothing. She was defending the wealth of the Kuwaiti oligarchy. And that justified the war against Saddam Hussein in 1999. And you can just go war by war and find the same pattern. We don't seem to kind of connect the dots. We just react on emotion, on feeling of revulsion, and sarin gas attacks. Why would Bashar al-Assad, when he's winning the war after 6 years, and when the Trump administration says it's up now to the Syrian people to decide who their president will be, not the United States, he basically has won. Why would he use sarin gas against his own people and risk losing everything? This is Looney Tunes. But the American people see the pictures, and they're fake news pictures. They see pictures of so-called white helmets, first responders in Syria, reaching down to pick up these dead children. And if you look closely at the pictures, supposedly sarin gas poisoned children, the first responders, their hands are bare, touching the bare skin of these dead children, sarin gas children, presumably. And you see in the background of these videos other people wearing no gas mask, whatever. And if you know anything about the chemical, biological warfare precautions that are standard state of the art, it calls for hazmat suits that completely cover the body. You have no skin contact. You have no breath contact. Otherwise, you're dead on the spot, even breathing the air around a sarin gas attack. It's one of the most toxic substances known to man. So this is a joke. It's a joke. And the Trump administration did not even allow the serious investigation by independent experts on chemical, biological warfare to be taken before they shot their missiles, their Tomahawk missiles from the Mediterranean. So it's exactly the same nonsense. And we get jacked up by all this silliness through 2 world wars. And, if we're stupid enough, we'll do it through a 3rd world war.
Mm-hmm. You can still go on YouTube, and there is you can see the propaganda cartoon regarding the Lusitania. Mm-hmm. And it's of that era, so it's a silent one. It's got, and it reads, shows a very crude cartoon of a German submarine, U-boat, torpedoing the Lusitania. And it's kind of funny because the cartoon has the Germans, the fiendish Germans, then fire a second torpedo causing a second explosion. Well, of course, as it turns out, the source of that second explosion was the fact that Lusitania was packed from bow to stern with armaments being shipped to the British Army. That's what was probably caused the second explosion, right? Sunk so fast.
Yes, the Lusitania. And this had to be admitted in court in Britain recently for legal reasons, that the Lusitania was filled to the gills with illegal arms shipment from the U.S. to Great Britain. Mm-hmm. And the Germans uncovered this, and, it was a violation and a justifiable act of war. But war is held, and there is never a winner in war. Mm-hmm. America doesn't win wars. Tell me one war, Tim, where the United States military has won a war. Did they win the Second World War? No, I don't think so. 29 million citizens of the Soviet Union gave their lives in that war. And at the very end, with a great rallying by Roosevelt of the American population after this allowed attack by the Japanese on Pearl Harbor, finally, the United States, after an incredible delay, enters the war to simply take the credit for the win after Germany and Russia had exhausted themselves on the field of battle in Eastern Europe. Yeah. By the way, the founder of the British SAS, Special Forces, told someone I knew at the time, a journalist, that one of the greatest mistakes of the British Empire during World War II was to think we could play the German against the Russian and defeat both of them and take over.
Yeah. But that was all part of that weird British strategy, was because both of them were too strong to take on directly. You get them to fight each other, and that's what they got. That's what they got in the First World War and the Second World War, because Russia had been being targeted by London and New York. I mean, the Bolsheviks were funded by London and New York. Trotsky was an agent sent in, and so was Lenin. Because Lenin came in from Germany, but that's all part of the Warburg family. Warburg connects to the New York Warburgs and the Federal Reserve and the City of London. And Trotsky was arrested by
the head of German wartime intelligence was a Warburg, and his brother was the creator of the model for the Federal Reserve as a private central bank to take from the U.S. Congress the constitutional power to print and coin money.
Mm-hmm.
That was one of the greatest coup d'etats of private bankers in history, I would say, is the coup d'etat of 1913 to create the Federal Reserve System and create the illusion that this is a governmental bank. It's a private central.
Yeah. And you have how much shocked the German banker during the Nazi period. He's good friends with Benjamin Strong, if I'm not Benjamin Strong.
Benjamin Strong, but more so Montague Norman.
I meant Montague Norman.
Most influential central banker in the world at that time.
And
he's the head of the Bank of England.
And he happens to be acquitted at Nuremberg.
He knew he would be because of his friends in the West. But he was also a Mason connected with all these circles. So
and that matters more than people like to think. The sort of networking, exactly, because that gets into the formation of the whole idea of the intelligence age is all Masonic, and of course the British Freemasonry and its role in the empire. It's managing and expanding the empire in the 19th century. There's a whole book written about it called Builders of Empire by Jessica Harlan Jacobs, I think is her name, Builders of Empire. And it's very academic, it's not conspiratorial. It just talks about this is a way you network and engage in high level malfeasance.
Exactly. To demystify Masonry, that's, I think, the essence of what it is.
Yeah, just high level criminality,
It's secret societies that work as networks, so you don't realize the connection of Mr. Jones to Mr. Smith in this newspaper or that congressional seat and so forth, but they're all following orders from the same, musician.
Yeah, and woe to those who are part of that network and talk about it. Now, in this article, you also mentioned this sort of the propaganda aspect. Of course, Walter Lippmann, Edward Bernays, they're very key figures in this stuff. And of course, Walter Lippmann, I think he wrote the book called Manufacturing Consent.
Yes.
Murrow, Edward R. Murrow, there's an award named after him. He's a heroic journalist. The guy was a stage actor and a propagandist, and you talk about his key role in getting America into the war were these broadcasts from London. We interrupt this program to bring you this, and that was all psychological warfare.
Sure. We interrupt this broadcast. This is London. He was broadcasting for CBS Radio out of London, and then he would create these dramatic depictions of the bombing of London by the Nazis and the Luftwaffe and so forth.
And there was mention the fact that it was the British that began strategic bombing, and of course there was no one broadcasting from Berlin or Hamburg or Dresden saying this is Dresden. You get none of that. But you mentioned his role in I guess his connection to the Frankfurt School, which is very interesting, which I didn't know prior to reading your article. Mm-hmm. This connections. Of course, they were brought in by the OSS. To see Bill Donovan and these guys. And after the war, they played a key role in shaping, Herbert Marcuse. They go out to Hollywood and they go into the universities, so they play a key role in shaping all these things. Particularly the neoconservative agenda that that became big in the 70s and 80s and took over the Reagan administration, and still very powerful today.
I'm not sure that I would connect the neocon ideology, which was more Leo Strauss and certain figures like that. Irving Kristol, the father William Criswell. I would call the neocons simply the public relations arm of the military-industrial complex, and then I think you understand very precisely what they're all about. The Frankfurt School was a much more subtle. Most of the neocons are rather stupid, to be honest. If you look at people like Victoria Nuland or Max Boot or Kagan, her husband, or his brother, and the intellectual depth is rather moronic, I would say. They just want to whip up a war through lies or whatever means they can, and feed the contracts to the military-industrial sponsors like the Olin Foundation and others. But the Frankfurt School was much more sophisticated. It was this soft power kind of manipulation, a little bit like the Tavistock Institute, where some of the Frankfurt School people in the U.S. Later linked up with after the Rockefellers bought up the Tavistock Institute in London.
That's right, yeah, and that's just why they went out to Hollywood and got into broadcasting and more of a cultural agenda, so the cultural Marxist agenda. But the key point to remember is they were sponsored and supported by the OSS, by the CIA, by the Rockefellers.
Yeah.
And kind of sort of this left-right paradigm we're given in the 20th century. How it's pretty for the most part false. It's a false left-right paradigm because it's the oligarchs that are trying to control the agenda by more or less controlling both sides or all sides and creating these false dialectics. So, so we don't ask the right questions. We're too busy battling each other, with these things. But as far as the in the Gods of Money, you talk about sort of this. Well, the time I have left. The overall monetary issue, the issue of controlling the money supply, how money's created in the banking system, in the Gods of Money, you go through the history of this. As early as in the United States, although we just won our independence, you talk about how British bankers had bought stock into the U.S. bank.
Alexander Hamilton created the first bank of the United States, and in the end of the 18th century, right after the Revolutionary War. Most people and most economic historians think that was a institution of the United States government. In fact, Hamilton, who was a British monarchist at heart, orchestrated the constitution of the Bank of the United States to allow foreign investors to become stockholders. And only a small percentage of the stock of the Bank of the United States was held by the United States government. And the greatest stockholders were the banks of the City of London, against whom the United States, supposedly Hamilton, as the chief of staff of General Washington, had, fought with their lives to get freedom from. So I would call Alexander Hamilton a traitor to the national interests of the United States. But, of course, nobody does that. They call him this great hero and this visionary. But the Bank of the United States was a private institution, and the second Bank of the United States was, again, a model on the first bank. And it was, as well, intended to take over the United States on the money side for what the British could not take over on the military side.
And you had, the bank's charter, the first bank, expires in 1811, and some people think that might have factored in the fermenting of the War of 1812.
I'm convinced it did. I'm convinced it played a key role in the War of 1812, where the Rothschilds in London told the British government, go and fire some cannon shells on Washington, D.C., and maybe do some things with the Indians up near Canada, upstate New York, to stir them up, and maybe down in New Orleans, get some things going there. And the war was a joke. It just, if you look at it in a serious geopolitical standpoint, it makes no sense unless from the standpoint of this failure to renew the charter of the Bank of the United States in 1811.
Mm-hmm. And you have, of course, Jackson takes on the bank and doesn't renew its charter, and it dies after losing its federal charter. And you have the independent treasury system in the interwar period. Last time that was the last time there was a balanced federal budget. So, but then you have that period. Then you have the outbreak of the Civil War in Lincoln, and some people think that Lincoln's refusal to go into debt and just issue greenbacks to pay for the war might have factored into the intrigues of his assassination, which is very.
Oh, I'm convinced it did.
Yeah,
because Lincoln issued this state money called greenbacks that was backed by the full faith and credit of the United States, assuming that they came out of the Civil War as victor against the South, which they did. And instead, the British wanted to lend money, the City of London wanted to lend money to Lincoln and to the U.S. Army to fight the Civil War at usurious interest rates, 30% and higher even. And Lincoln said, no, we don't do this. We issue greenbacks, and if people believe in the United States and what we're fighting for, the rightness of it, they will accept this as currency. And that happened. And they went off the British gold standard, and that London was furious about. I'm convinced that was involved in the financing of John Wilkes Booth and the assassination of Lincoln after the war.
Mm-hmm. And of course, that gets strange connections to Masonry as well. Knights of the Golden Circle in Canada, of course, which is British, and that's a wider conspiracy there. Yeah, it's very, very interesting to say the least.
When you look at them in detail, they all kind of are pretty similar. The JFK assassination, the Lincoln assassination, and so forth.
Mm-hmm. But then you have, between 1865 and 1913, you have no central bank in the United States, but a series of panics are fomented or created. Of course, you have the 1907 Knickerbocker Trust failure, which was, some people think was spread by a whisper campaign by J.P. Morgan to justify the creation of a central bank in this Banking Reform Act, which, of course, was shepherded by Nelson Aldrich, who eventually married into the Rockefeller family. I think his daughter married John.
Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller.
Yeah. And the creation of this monstrosity, the central bank, and then at that point the coup is complete, I guess you could say, right? They've gotten control of the money supply.
Yeah, if Henry Kissinger summarized what I call my trilogy of books, the Century of War, Anglo-American Oil Politics, the Seeds of Destruction, the Hidden Agenda of Genetic Manipulation, and then The Gods of Money. He said back in the 70s, when he was more powerful than the President of the United States, I would say, in Washington, Kissinger said, and he was a direct protege of the Rockefeller circles right up until today. And he said, if you control oil, you control entire nations because you control their economy. If you control food, you control the people, their health, their lack of health, if they starve to death or whatever. And if you control money, you control the entire world. And that is the agenda of this deep state or this Rockefeller faction or the American patriarchs, whatever name you want to give them. That's their agenda. It's rather simple and rather stupid in my view. But
full spectrum dominance.
Yeah, well, that's the military side of it, yeah.
Yeah, but basically you have to control everything, or you can't have any areas of independence or to challenge your dominance. Cultural, economic, political,
Yeah.
And
that's what Donald Trump is there to do.